Welcome to all of you. Welcome to those who have joined us here in person. And I know there are quite a few people joining us online. Welcome to you as well. I'd like to thank the sponsoring groups for this evening. And you can see their names on the screen. Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. It's based here at Eastern Mennonite University, but involves several Mennonite colleges and Mennonite Central Committee. Shenandoah Chapter of the Sierra Club, the Climate Action Alliance of the Valley, Clean Energy for All, and the Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Erik Curren, who's worked for a decade in the solar power industry while writing about energy, climate change, and U.S. history. He and I are colleagues at Secure Futures, which is a solar development company based in Stanton, and it is the company that helped EMU go solar since the first installation on Hartzler Library in 2011. And I'll just note that at the time, a 104 kilowatt system on the roof of the library was the largest solar array in Virginia. That was soon to be outdone by other institutions as this industry has grown dramatically in the last decade. Erik's previous books include The Solar Patriot, A Citizen's Guide to Helping America Win Clean Energy Independence. His work aims to draw inspiration and lessons for success today from stories of people in the past who fought with courage and conscience to solve the biggest problems facing our nation and the world. The book that we are celebrating tonight, Abolish Oil Now, offers a model to help unblock action to save civilization from runaway climate change while there's still time, the historic challenge of our generation. Erik completed a BA in English at Washington and Lee University and received his PhD in English from the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Erik. We look forward to having you share with us.
Lauren, thank you so much. And thanks to Doug here at EMU, and to Joy, and to all the other folks in the area who sponsored this event and helped to make it happen. I've known the environmental community here in Harrisonburg for as long as I've been with the solar company. And Harrisonburg fights well above its weight when it comes to clean energy and sustainability, as does EMU. And Lauren pointed out how the solar array on the library here was the largest at the time. And I always have to emphasize, it wasn't the largest at any college or university. It was the largest in the States. Dominion, utilities, big corporations, the Navy, nobody had a bigger solar array than EMU at that time. So I just think that folks at EMU should be proud of your leadership. And I continue to see leadership on clean energy at EMU. This book puts together two subjects. I'm sure you're all interested in climate change. I hope you're also interested in American history. It's not something that you usually hear about in relation to climate change. If they talk about history, it's some paleo, climatology from millions of years ago, ice cores and CO2. But rarely do I see people talk about our political and cultural history, which for me is a source of great inspiration. And I'd like to share some of that inspiration with you tonight. I'd also like to share the whole point of this book, which I think is a model to save our species and our civilization from destruction, if I can be so bold about it. But I want to start, and I'm putting together two subjects that are controversial. Climate change is controversial enough. And you put it together with slavery. I have people say, are you comparing oil to slavery? And I say, yeah, I'm sorry, but I am. And so I know that's a bold thing to do, perhaps foolish, but I'd like to explain to you why I think that's an apt comparison tonight. And so if we are talking about slavery, I'm going to open with that. I did a little research before I came here, And of course, I know that folks at EMU care about solar power, clean energy, and climate, and also social justice and racial justice. But I didn't know the history of Mennonites when it came to anti-slavery and abolition until I did a Google search. And some of you may be aware, but in fact, a statement from Mennonites and Quakers from Germantown, Pennsylvania, published in 1688, is the oldest anti-slavery document in North America. So this is another first, I think, that Mennonite people can be proud of. I'm going to read you just a little bit from the statement against slavery addressed to the Germantown monthly meeting in 1688. These are the reasons why we are against the traffic of body men as followeth. Is there any that would be done or handled at this manner? Viz. To be sold or made a slave for all the time of his life. Now, though they are black, we cannot conceive that there is any more liberty to have them slaves as it is to have other white ones. There is a saying that we shall do to all men like as we be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. And those who steal or rob men, and those who buy or purchase them, are they not all alike? Here, talking about Pennsylvania, here is liberty of conscience, which is right and reasonable. Here ought to be liberty of the body, except of evildoers, which is another case. But to bring men hither, or to rob and sell them against their will, we stand against. In Europe, there are many oppressed for conscience sake. And here, there are those oppressed which are of a black color. So I know a little bit about the history of Anabaptists facing political oppression in Europe. And I think the folks who wrote this statement could obviously sympathize with people who were very different from them, obviously a different race, come from a totally different place. The men who signed this all have German names that I can't begin to pronounce, but that didn't stop them from sympathizing with their fellow countrymen who were enslaved. And so this is a long history of conscience and of standing up for what we now know to be right. People get angry about slavery. They got angry about slavery in the 17th century. They got angry about it in the 18th and 19th, and rightly so. And people today are angry about our lack of progress on climate change. I'm angry. I don't want to be angry about it. I work for a solar panel company. I just want to be a nice business dude who's helping people put solar panels on their roof. I really wish that was enough. And there are some people who say, oh, all we need to do is just unchain the power of business, and we don't need any sort of messy political activism or make anybody uncomfortable or ask people to give up anything. You know, it's just going to be pretty much everything very comfortable and friendly, and we're all going to make some money. And I really wish that that was enough. But I can tell you from somebody who's worked in the solar industry for 10 years, that's not enough. The solar panels are ready. They're cheaper than they've ever been. People want them. Why aren't they on every third rooftop in America? It's not because the economy isn't ready. It's because there's a force blocking them in politics. There's a force that makes fossil fuels cheaper than they should be. Not just because it doesn't account for their pollution, but because they get actual subsidies to squirt oil out of the ground and dig coal out of the ground. They are still getting taxpayer subsidies to do that. We know it's destroying the climate and endangering our future, but we're still paying for that to happen. That makes me mad. That's an advantage that clean energy doesn't have. We get a small amount of subsidies and a small amount of help. But if you've ever seen the statistics, the amount of money invested in subsidizing fossil fuels is 10 or 20 or 50 times more than clean energy. So we're paying to do something that's killing us. And it's not because we don't know the science. I could show you a bunch of charts on CO2 concentrations, ice cores, or at Mauna Loa, a whole bunch of charts about science. Do you think you need to know more science at this point? Do we really need more charts about CO2? Do we pretty much know, like we've known for the past 30 years, that climate change is wrecking our future? We don't need more charts. What we need is to get the people out of the way who are blocking action. And why are these people blocking action? These are not bad people. These are not people who want to destroy civilization. These are people who are used to doing things a certain way. They're used to doing business a certain way. And they like it. And so to them, it just seems like somebody wants this whole climate change somehow, or maybe it's not that big a deal anyway. But the money is real. The money in Houston and Anchorage and Riyadh and Lagos, the money is real. And so there's a whole bunch of forces that are holding the rest of us hostage so that they can continue to make very big money. And so at some point I came, this is very frustrating to me in the solar industry, very frustrating. I came across an article once by Chris Hayes from MSNBC. He said that the amount of money that oil companies would stand to lose if all the remaining oil was left in the ground was about $10 trillion. It's the same amount of money that Southern slaveholders lost, adjusted for inflation, when the 13th Amendment was passed in December of 1865 and all enslaved people were free. I thought, wow, that's a funny coincidence. And so I looked further into the analogy between slavery and oil. And I found that, as with climate change, it wasn't for lack of information that white Americans didn't stop slavery. People had all the information they needed. They didn't need more charts and graphs. They didn't need more pictures. They knew. It was a small group of people who made a lot of money from enslaving their fellow people who were blocking action. And the rest of the people just had to be held hostage to that. Obviously, the people who were enslaved suffered most. But everybody in America suffered because of slavery. Now, tragically, it took the most bloody war ever fought on American soil to end slavery. Well, we can't afford for that to happen with climate change. It's not a different scenario anyway. There's no chance of that. But I did find in my research that there are security analysts who say that if climate change goes unchecked, there's a possibility for war much deadlier than the American Civil War. And so this sort of thing seems to me to be a very apt parallel. That, number one, the threat is not just to polar bears or people in low-lying Pacific islands, but the threat is to us. Maybe a place like Virginia won't experience wildfires or droughts or towns caving in on the coast. I mean, we might, it's already happening in Virginia Beach. But let's just say we don't experience the worst of weather disasters. Maybe that's somebody else. But we are at risk from the political and social disasters that could follow from the stresses on society that climate chaos will create. And so I want to read you a section from the book about that in a minute. But first, I just want to a couple quotes to show you why I feel like it was right to be angry about slavery, and it's right to be angry about climate change. So, William Lloyd Garrison, who was the leading white abolitionist before the Civil War, he started a newspaper called The Liberator, which became the leading propaganda arm of the abolitionist movement. A price was put on his head in southern states. Georgia, I think, had $5,000 if you could capture William Lloyd Garrison and bring him to trial. He was hated in the South. His newspapers were stopped in the mails. William Lloyd Garrison was not a moderate. I'm aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or to speak or to write with moderation. No, no. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher, and tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. He wrote that in 1831. Well, in 2021, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island said something similar. He said about climate change and about the campaign of fossil fuel companies to spread lies and confusion about it, I think history will look back on the covert operation run by the fossil fuel industry against its own country to debilitate and incapacitate our own government from addressing this problem as one of history's vilest political acts. That is not moderate language. That is pointing the finger at a certain group of people who are holding the rest of us hostage so that they can continue to make big money. One of history's vilest acts. It's bad enough to sell fossil fuels, but to spread a campaign of lies about them is just adding cover up to the crime. So I'm upset, and that's why I wrote this book. And I hope you'll get upset too. But in a peaceful way. If we don't get upset enough, things will keep going the way they are. And all the charts and graphs and ice core pictures have not stopped the greenhouse gases from doubling over the last 40 years. Okay, we are not winning the fight against climate change. All the business dudes like me trying to put as many solar panels on roofs as we can't do that fast enough in the current environment. And so people who study war, and I understand that many people in the Mennonite tradition are anti-war. And so I'll have something for you in a minute, I think that you'll especially appreciate. But people who study war, not because they like war, but because they want to prevent it, they want to understand what causes it. Defense analysts, they say that climate change is a threat multiplier. That's what they call it in the Pentagon, a threat multiplier. It doesn't mean that climate change will necessarily cause wars, but that other things that cause wars will be made worse by the effects of climate chaos. For example, Gwynne Dyer, who is a global security analyst, says there is a possibility of wars, even nuclear wars, if temperatures rise 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. Now you might think that's crazy. Okay, yeah, climate change is bad, but come on, nuclear war? Hold on to that for a minute. UN Secretary General Guterres says that metaphorically, we're already waging war on nature. Humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Nature always strikes back, and it is already doing so with growing force and fury. And I think if you see the climate news, every year it gets hotter. Every year there's more wildfires. It's not just in Australia. It's not just in California. They have heat waves in Seattle and Portland. And the news from all around the country and all around the world is just like from the book of Revelations. It's just getting worse and worse. And so Gwynne Dyer says that there's a chance of nuclear war because of climate change. Well, let me tell you his scenario. And maybe then you'll think, well, that's maybe not so unrealistic. Here's how it goes. Climate heating contributes to a series of heat waves and droughts around the world, perhaps 2 or 3 years in a row, causing wheat harvests to fail. Imagine a country in South Asia, a country whose government is already somewhat unstable, perhaps ruled by a military junta. This country is not necessarily a successful democracy. This is a country that has difficulty feeding its citizens even in a good year. But this is one of the countries on earth that happens to have nuclear weapons. So imagine such an unstable country facing serious droughts for 2 or 3 years in a row. Since the government lacks funds to purchase enough grain on the world market, which is hit by higher prices because of droughts elsewhere, food supplies dwindle, prices skyrocket until grain cannot be had at any price. Hungry citizens stage protests that explode into food riots in major cities, which spread across the country, bringing widespread civil unrest. Authorities respond with police repression, beatings, and arrests, which further inflame the population. Military officers, some of the most trusted leaders in a nation whose civilian government is infamous for its corruption, step in to stop the violence. Generals and colonels depose the flailing president in a coup and form a national emergency government. So far, sounds like stuff that happens without climate change. To quell popular unrest and solve the water crisis, the new junta tries to get access to water resources fast by demanding more from rivers that cross over from a neighboring nation, also nuclear armed. A series of diplomatic threats, buildups of troops and weapons along the border, terrorist attacks inside the neighbor's territory, and finally, armed clashes between the two armies spiral out of control. As chaos strikes both governments, somebody on one side or the other fires the first missile at an enemy airbase, triggering an escalated response on both sides, hitting major cities and each national capital. Thus begins and ends the world's first, and one must hope, last nuclear war. Now, to be fair, military planners see this as an unlikely scenario. There are many more scenarios that will destabilize the world's governments that they see as more likely, less dangerous, but more likely. And so this chapter talks about sort of the ladder of threats that military planners see that climate change will exacerbate. And you can imagine it's things like terrorism, militaries overthrowing governments, supplies of food being cut off, et cetera, refugees. Okay. So I don't think it's unrealistic to say that climate change could help exacerbate the kind of international conflict that we already see. And for a world that has already got armed conflicts across the globe, there will be more of them, they'll be in more places, and they'll be worse because of climate change. So you don't need something like the American Civil War in order to have a scenario connected with climate change where many people suffer and die. So as people of compassion, people who don't like war, people who oppose human suffering, and I count myself as one, I ask, okay, so it wasn't possible for Americans to abolish slavery without the Civil War. We were not able to figure that one out. But was anybody in a similar situation able to figure it out? Because if they could figure it out, then maybe that's a model that we could use to abolish oil without the world descending into a hell of constant warfare. And I was fortunate to find, in fact, there was such an example. Great Britain had a bunch of colonies in the Caribbean Sea, which they called the West Indies, where they grew sugarcane. And these colonies included places like Jamaica. And believe it or not, the British found their Caribbean colonies to be so valuable that if they had to choose between the 13 colonies of North America and Jamaica, they would choose Jamaica. Okay? They did a lot more trade with the West Indies than they did with the 13 colonies of North America. So these were very wealthy places, and the families who owned the sugar plantations in the West Indies were very well connected back home in England. These were members of the aristocracy of the royal court. They were bankers and members of parliament and people who had a lot of power in society at the time. Well, there was a small group of abolitionists in England, just like there was here, and these were not powerful people. These were people of conscience whose power came from their words and their heart and not from their wallets or the office that they held. But yet, these men and women of conscience were able to start a campaign about the time of the American Revolution that wound up successfully abolishing slavery in the British Empire without war. Okay? One of the greatest measures, perhaps, of human history was when the British passed an act in 1832 to end slavery and free 750,000 men and women in the West Indies. How did they do it? They did it in a way that's still controversial today. So no, there was no need for a civil war. But there was some violence. There were hundreds of years of slave rebellions, in fact. They didn't kill the number of people that were killed in our Civil War. It was a few hundred rather than a few 100,000. But there was violence involved. And of course, the everyday violence of slavery is something that you must take into account. But putting those aside, the British managed to abolish slavery by paying slaveholders to walk away from the institution. Now, the British government had to take out bonds to do this, and they were still paying those bonds off until a few years ago. And when Her Majesty's Treasury announced that they had paid them off, started a huge controversy of people in England who thought, how dare you give money to enslavers instead of to the enslaved? In fact, the enslaved got nothing. There were no reparations. The people who got the money were the people keeping people in chains. Well, to us, that does not seem just. That seems like the exact opposite of what you should do. And if you were to apply this model to the oil industry, that would be like saying, are we going to pay Exxon to leave oil in the ground? Well, that seems terribly unjust, doesn't it? Wouldn't it be better to pay companies like ours to put up solar panels? But the brute fact of it is, companies like ours are small. And we don't have a lot of pull in Washington or on Wall Street. And who has pull on Washington and Wall Street? It's the established traditional energy companies. So let me walk you through this British slavery abolition for a minute. Richard Barker, who is an investment analyst in London, who I interviewed for the book, he said, the cost of damage to property and lost productivity in the American Civil War turns out to be between 12 and 18 times more expensive than the compensation that was agreed in Britain. The American Civil War cost $4 million a day to fight, and that was their money. If you were to put that in today's dollars, it was an incredibly expensive war. President Lincoln offered to compensate enslavers for their enslaved people, and they all said no. But if they hadn't said no, think of all the lives that could have been saved, 620,000 soldiers and sailors dead on both sides, and then countless civilians, and then all that money. So the British did it differently. And here's what happened. The Slavery Abolition Act had two clauses which some abolitionists opposed vehemently. Yet these compromises with the West Indian planters' lobby were almost certainly crucial to making British abolition happen when it did, instead of years or decades later. Keep in mind, the British abolished slavery 30 years before the United States. It doesn't mean that slavery was on the way out. Slavery was not, in fact, on the way out. Slavery was very profitable, more profitable than oil is today. Slavery was not going to abolish itself. First, the act awarded cash payments of about 20 million pounds to slave owners in compensation for the loss of their property in enslaved people, an amount equal to as much as $414 billion today. Cash payments represented 45% of the value of each enslaved person. The first instance of detailed statistical analysis by the UK government, based on a listing of every enslaved person by age, sex, skill level, health, and level of productivity on their plantation. Meanwhile, slaves themselves got nothing. Second, slave owners would get another form of compensation in the form of additional years of work from their former slaves. This was to be the slave's own contribution to his or her freedom, which represented another 35% of each person's assessed value. Under the terms of the Slavery Abolition Act, on January 1st, 1834, slaves wouldn't become free right away. They would temporarily become apprentices, most of whom would be forced to keep working for their old masters without pay until 1840. Black workers who hated this requirement mounted widespread strikes in the West Indies. Supporting their protest, back in Britain, abolitionists got more than 1 million signatures. Again, the activist campaign was successful. Under pressure, Parliament ended the apprenticeship period 2 years early and declared all former slaves free forever on August 1st, 1838. So here's an example of how an activist campaign made a huge difference in the lives of people, even when up against very big money and very big power. All right, so how could this possibly work? Again, it seems morally repugnant to pay the people who are doing wrong to stop doing wrong. It seems, believe me, as someone who works in the solar industry, that would make me super mad. But I'm just trying to look at what's worked in the past in history. How could this possibly work when it comes to oil? How could somehow paying off Exxon help us to avoid climate catastrophe and the global state of continuous warfare that it could possibly bring? Now we are at the point in history where we must not just restrict oil, but abolish it completely, I write. Just as slave rebellions helped convince Britons in the 1830s that slavery was no longer an institution that they could support, so recent climate disasters have convinced more people that fossil fuels must go. Quote, Mother Nature is rebelling from all the CO2 we're pumping into the atmosphere. We're seeing increasing numbers of significant events of losses worldwide related to storms and fires. The human cost for climate chaos is too high for Richard Barker, the investment banker, and the economic cost is too high also. And this is a quote from Barker. The governor of the Bank of England has identified that climate change can pose a significant risk to global financial security, perhaps like the ferocious slave rebellion in Jamaica, finally forcing people over the line. Perhaps what we'll see is a major weather-related catastrophe. A major climate-induced financial shock in the markets will push governments and financial markets to make the final move to the equivalent of abolishing slavery. The partial compensation that the British government paid to slave owners can serve as a precedent to induce fossil fuel companies and their allies to agree to leave most of the remaining oil, gas, and coal in the ground. Quote, we need to price carbon properly. We need to tax carbon effectively. The polluters need to take their loss. And finally, though unpalatable for some, is that we probably need to pay compensation. What form would that compensation take? There's a compensation number, a period of time. The slaves are going to work for you for an absolute loss, Barker told me, using the analogy of compensation to British slave owners in 1833 to what oil companies might expect in the future. Barker envisions compensation for fossil fuel companies to abolish oil, not in terms of cash payments like those given to British slaveholders. Instead, compensation today would come as additional time for oil, gas, and coal companies to operate before being completely shut down. More like the unpaid work that recently freed people in the West Indies had to offer their masters under the transition period of apprenticeship. Barker went on to tell me how fossil fuel companies may choose compensated abolition as the lesser of two evils from their point of view. Either plan to gradually shut down voluntarily their operations with the chance to recoup some of their loss, or try to fight it out, but risk taking a much bigger loss later. And this is what Richard Barker would say. Today, an oil company is valued based on its current cash flows and reserves. You're running a huge risk as a corporate leader that carbon will be taxed in the near future, or that you might be prohibited from exploring for or extracting oil. Companies need to understand that there's an absolute risk of discontinuity in their business today. Do you want to take that risk? Or should we insulate you from that risk? You could align your operations with the Paris Accord. You'll wind down exploration and we'll put in a tax structure that will encourage this. If society provides some help to phase out their operations, then perhaps dirty energy companies can be convinced to absorb the remainder of the value of their future profits as a loss. Barker was very quick to tell me he wasn't, again, talking about giving cash to Exxon. He was really talking about just making some kind of a deal where they would assess the risk of continuing to try to do business as usual and perhaps have the hammer of society come down on them very hard in the future, or cut some kind of deal now to phase out their operations in a more planned fashion. Now, for me, I have a lot of problems with cutting any deal with Exxon, given all the crimes, frankly, that company in particular, they're the worst of the worst. When it comes to the climate denial, the lies, the intimidation of climate scientists, this is not a company that I think deserves any special treatment. They deserve to be hauled before Congress and have their CEO constantly having to testify about all the evil things that they've done just to keep the profits flowing. I have no sympathy for them at all. I have some sympathy for the people who work in the oil fields. It's not their fault, but I have no sympathy for the executives. But I'm trying, as a student of history and a student of politics and someone who has worked in the energy industry, I'm trying to imagine a realistic scenario that gets us to where the scientists say we need to get. Scientists say we need in this decade to make major transformations to our economy and to start cutting our greenhouse gas emissions in half. Think about that. In this decade? Do you think we're going to get there by chaining ourselves to the White House gate, or by going to shareholder meetings and putting up resolutions? Do you think we're going to get there by taking oil companies' word for it, that they have net zero carbon plans, that they're going to cut their carbon to net zero, even while they continue to explore for oil in the North Pole? None of the solutions out there feel to me like they're realistic enough and fast enough to get us to where we need to be by the end of this decade. It really seems to me to just be more of the same. More promises, more greenwashing, more ways to just excuse them or distract the public so that they can keep exploring and pumping more oil. And then they'll turn it into plastic. And so it continues. And I don't think we can afford to remain on this cycle for another 20 or 30 or 40 years. So I think the time to consider doing something radically different has arrived, because what we've been doing is not working. And we don't have time to do it much longer. So what do we have to lose by considering something different? And I had one climate scientist who I had look at my manuscript, and I quote a climate scientist in the book who says that we need to forgive oil companies. It's time to stop criticizing them and start working with them, because after all, companies that build pipelines could put clean hydrogen in their pipeline just as easily as they could put natural gas. But these companies have had 40 years to become clean energy companies. BP bought a solar company 30 years ago. And what did they do with it? They flailed around for a while and they shut it down. Every few years you hear about how some big oil company is going to become a solar or wind company. And then you don't hear about it anymore. These companies are not going to become solar and wind companies. They're going to talk about becoming solar and wind companies. That's what they're going to do. They're going to talk about it. And they're going to talk and talk and talk until another 10, 20, or 30 years have gone by. And meanwhile, they're exploring for oil on the North Pole. So if I could come up with a program, it would be cut some kind of deal with the oil companies, which is stop all new exploration for oil. Stop looking for oil at the North Pole. You don't need more oil supplies. That's number one. Stop exploring. Number two, stop trying to make new stuff out of oil. We don't need more plastics. We don't need hydrogen made from cracked natural gas. We don't need any of these garbage products that their innovation, their labs and their technology, they're so good at innovation. We don't want their innovation. Stop. No more fancy ideas to reuse oil in some newfangled way. That's number two. And number three, a reasonable agreement with the American people and the people of the world to phase out oil, gas, and coal production by 2030, certain milestones by 2030, certain milestones by 2035, and to phase the whole thing out by 2050. No more oil and gas for any purpose except maybe a small amount for pharmaceuticals or some very specialized use, but not for burning in cars. Now, this is not a fully developed program. You can find a lot of developed programs out there to phase out oil and gas and coal. These are just three simple points that I think any program should have. And I think as people who care about the future of humanity and of the earth, for people who recognize that just as ending slavery was the moral issue of the mid-19th century, that saving civilization from climate chaos is the moral issue of the early 21st century. We are those people. If we know that, you can't unknow that. You know, you can't go back home and say, nah, it's not that urgent. You know, somebody else will take care of it. You can't. I don't see much choice but becoming an oil abolitionist. And that means getting angry, especially getting angry about people who lie, people who spread lies, and people who pretend that they're helping the climate, when in fact, all they're doing is the same old thing they've always done just to keep making money for a few more decades. And don't stop being mad. It doesn't mean that you wish people ill. It doesn't mean you think that they're evil. But what they're doing is destroying our future. And that makes me mad. And I'm going to stay mad. But I'm going to take that anger and I want to channel it into something positive. And something positive is like William Lloyd Garrison said, I will not compromise. I'm not interested in moderation anymore. This is an extreme threat that requires people to tell the truth, even if that offends people. At the same time, it might sound like a contradiction. At the same time, I don't think that we will succeed just plain beating up oil companies in time to stop them from producing more oil. I don't think it's enough for activists to just beat up oil companies. It wasn't enough for abolitionists. So I think we're going to have to come to the oil companies with some kind of a deal. But first, they have to stop lying. They have to stop spreading lies, and they have to stop campaigning to keep doing what they're doing. And that hasn't happened yet. So you can't sit down with somebody who isn't acting in good faith. So I think we still need to beat them up for a while. I'm not ready to forgive oil companies yet. But if they come to the table in good faith and they say, we recognize there's no way we can keep exploring at the North Pole, making plastics and producing fossil fuels and still save the climate. We recognize that. Then I think we should talk. Then I think we should be willing to work with them on a program that would allow them to draw down their operations in a planned fashion. And for them to take their capital out of their business, not 100% of it, but some of it, and not have 100% loss. Because if we're not willing to work with them in the end, they're going to fight as long as they can. And we can't afford that. It's going to be much cheaper and more humane to work with oil companies when they finally get it than it will be to try to fight them and get everything. So it's a bit of a paradoxical position, I understand. In the end, I think that we can learn a lot from the abolitionists of the 19th century, who basically ran the most successful activist campaign in human history. Just think of what they accomplished. Abolitionists in England and in America. These were a small minority the population, very small, under 5%. More people care about climate than were opposed to slavery. A very small group of people who were considered very obnoxious because all they would do is talk about how bad slavery was. You go to a party and they're talking about how bad slavery was. Not the most fun people to talk to. But these people, this small, obnoxious minority, managed to do something that had never been done in human history. Slavery goes back to the beginning of civilization. Across the globe, they managed to free 750,000 people in the West Indies purely through legislation. And unfortunately, it took a civil war, but even so, 4 million people were freed in the United States, the largest emancipation of enslaved people ever in human history. If they can do that, we can do this. So, thank you.
Thank you. The sign-up sheets are some to sign up.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for bringing history to life and applying history lessons. If we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it. I think it was a phrase I've heard sometimes, and it's important for us to know our history and apply it to current events and do the best we can. Thank you. So we're going to take a few minutes for any questions, either from you all here, or we can read them online. If those of you joining by Zoom or Facebook have any questions, please post those. And we'll make sure that those get onto the floor here as well. And we'll look to Erik to answer any of those or respond. Any responses that any of you want to share would be welcome too. And we can pass this mic around so that we are recording this so that people will have access to it later as well.
Erik, can you speak to likelihood or possibility how they might play into the budget proposal? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So Joyce's question was about insurance companies and financial institutions and what role they might play in abolishing oil. So it was, I was glad that I spoke with an investment banker from London, which is one of the world's major financial markets, where they're doing things like trading carbon credits and looking at futures of companies who are carbon positive, carbon negative, and trying to include that in their analysis. So I think it was Bill McKibben a few years back, maybe 2017, 2018, who started this campaign to try to get banks to pay more attention to the activity of the people that they were financing vis-a-vis fossil fuels. And I think that campaign has shown a lot of results in a short amount of time. Well, I like these efforts that are targeted at insurance companies, banks, and Wall Street and the financial sector. It's kind of like the divestment campaigns against apartheid back at the end of the last century. Colleges and universities have become big players in these campaigns to divest their schools or their groups' investment funds from companies that produce fossil fuels and to even put them into companies that produce clean energy. I think that's a positive development because what oil, gas, and coal companies are going to listen to probably more than activists is their money people. And you can see that, for example, the pandemic was very hard on oil companies. Exxon was kicked out of the the top Dow Jones industrial average companies, and it had been in there for like 90 years. And so if Exxon is suffering, you can imagine that all the other major oil companies are suffering, and the small ones certainly are too. A lot of them went bankrupt and were being bought up by the bigger companies. And so money, I think, is an excellent lever to put pressure on the oil companies and bring them to the table. They're not at the table yet, but I think money is one of the best levers that we have, along with public opinion, to get these companies to stop trying to just keep producing, exploring and producing fossil fuels while covering it up with a bunch of greenwashing. Money could be the lever that it takes to finally get them to start telling the truth.
Well, first, thanks a lot. And to follow up on what you were just commenting about, they're going to listen to money more than they're going to listen to activists. But activists in the past have played a very important part in postponing and making any action on the part of oil or gas companies, continue and make the whole project more expensive or socially unacceptable. And therefore, then the money becomes the issue. So activists, I think, have a very important part. And I would like to know, if you agree or what your reaction to that would be. Also, I'm interested in organizations that you think are the best at bringing to light the lies of the fossil fuel industry.
So I think activists have two roles to play. Number one, going up against fossil fuel companies directly and trying to get public policy, working through the electoral process, through the political process, trying to get public policy that discourages fossil fuels and encourages clean energy. So that's one thing that activists have been successful in. We just need to have more success. But then I think we can go indirectly through the financial institutions that are consumer facing, like Chase Bank, for example. They have retail branches that Bill McKibben's group has had people come into and close the place down. And it's not so much the retail banking that the protesters are against, but the retail gives them a lever, because Chase has a brand that's known in the public. They do a lot of credit cards. They value their brand among the general public. And so activists can hurt their brand. Activists can put their brand at risk. And that can make them willing to negotiate on their business banking. I think the activists have an indirect role there to then get to the oil companies through the financial sector. As far as organizations go, I like the traditional groups. I'm very impressed with what you all do in Harrisonburg. I'm very impressed, with what you all have done over the years. I think these kind of grassroots groups are so encouraging. I like some of the traditional groups. I still like the Sierra Club. I like 350.org, but then, I'm talking about slavery, and I didn't say anything about race, which I apologize for. But in fact, the book does talk about this, that people of color, especially African Americans, suffer more from fossil fuel pollution than almost anybody else, because it's in communities that are heavily populated by low-income folks, African Americans, and other people of color, where fossil fuel facilities tend to be put. So that's where you have refineries and plastics factories and tank farms. And so it's not just climate change, it's not just global pollution, but it's also local pollution. And it's taken the environmental movement too long to care about local pollution. A lot of us don't live near those facilities, so we care about the CO2. But for folks who live in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, they care about the stuff that's in their water and it's in their air, and that's giving their kids asthma, and that's giving them cancer. And so these folks are overwhelmingly people of color. And believe it or not, in Cancer Alley, some of those African American communities are descended from communities of freed people who were freed after the Civil War. And their ancestors worked on that exact land or very nearby when it was a plantation that grew sugar. So the connection between slavery and oil is not just metaphorical. In some cases, it's literal, and it affects people of color especially strongly. So I like groups that are run by and focused on issues of people of color. I really like what the folks down in Cancer Alley in Louisiana are doing, for example. There are some activists who've gotten some national attention, and there are some people from around the country who've gone in to try to help them fight the Formosa plastics plant, for example. There are a few groups that are national that focus on issues of people of color, but a lot of them tend to be local. And so, the Sierra Club has actually gotten better about focusing on environmental justice, on climate justice. And Bill McKibben says now the climate movement needs to become the climate justice movement. So I think you can still go at it through the mainstream environmental groups, but I think, Kathy, if one of these areas interests you in particular, I don't know if there's any environmental justice issues in our area. It's always nice to do something close by. I remember when the Atlantic Coast Pipeline was still an issue, of course, Union Hill was a very similar area to what I'm talking about. You had a community of descendants of freed people, African Americans, who were in some cases living on land that their families had gotten after the Civil War. And this was being threatened by Dominion's compressor station, which was being built actually on an old plantation. So again, it's the same thing. But if we can be allies to those frontline people of color who live in these so-called fence line communities, who they have to deal with this in so much more of a real way than I do, because it's their air and that's their water. If we can help them out, I think that's a powerful combination.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions from online, and I'm going to read two of them out. There's a third one if we have time, but I'll start with these two. So one question is, fossil fuel consumption is a global problem. Can you speak to abolishing oil and coal globally? And the second question is, what role do you see for people of faith and religious communities to play a leading role in moving toward where we need to go?
So my global answer is that the United States is the world's largest economy, and though we lack the largest population, we do have the most political power. No nation, not China, not India, not Russia, not even the European Union, has the amount of influence that we have around the world, economically and politically. So I actually think a lot of other countries in the world would have done more if we hadn't been stopping them, if we hadn't stayed out of the Kyoto Treaty, or sabotaged the Rio negotiations. We have not been merely sitting on the sidelines and watching the rest of the world act. We have been actively blocking the rest of the world from action. So I think, number one, we should stop blocking them. That would be a help. You should do no harm. But number two, we're the world's leader. We should lead on clean energy. We should lead on reining in fossil fuel companies. But the problem is, unfortunately, as Sarah Palin put it so well, the United States is a bit of a petrostate. The division between oil and state is not as strong as it should be. And so we need to get oil out of government. Once we can get oil out of government, the United States can stop being a force of reaction and start being a force of progress. And I think the rest of the world is just waiting for us to take the lead. I think they will applaud any positive initiative that we take. And then the second question was about people of faith. When you study the abolition movement, you see that people of faith were so important. The churches were so important. They were the conscience of America when it came to looking at the evils of slavery. And to a certain extent, people of faith had been the conscience of America and the world when talking about creation care. So I think people of faith have already set an excellent example. I understand that not every person of faith cares about climate change, but some of the most impressive activists who have chained themselves to the White House, and I didn't mean to make a disparaging comment about that. I think I haven't done it. When I see the people who do it, I'm grateful. And so I think they should keep doing that. And I think people of faith should keep leading in their congregations and their communities. And I think it's spreading. I know because in my church, which is not an especially activist church, there's already talk about how we want to do something more for the environment. We're not going to be leaders. We're followers. But the people who are leaders are making it easier for us to follow.
Is there another question from the audience here? Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. This has been really thought-provoking. And you've talked a lot about like money and how we're gonna kind of work, make a deal with some of the corporations. So I'm curious where you think, in your opinion, that money could come from. Obviously, it would be a pretty big chunk of change, and that would probably be something to consider.
Right. So again, I'm not talking about cash payments. I'm not talking about even the kind of subsidies that they get now. In fact, I think those subsidies need to go. But this could be part of a negotiation. It could be rather than the subsidies going right away, we'll phase out the subsidies over a 5 or 10 year period. So right there is a financial benefit to the fossil fuel industry that they don't deserve. But being a realist and recognizing that it's better to accomplish our goal than to be right. I hold my nose and I look at all the ways that society now supports fossil fuel companies and I say, how could those be negotiating chips if we beat them up enough to bring them to the table? How can we say, okay, all the stuff that we give you now, we're going to take it away, but we'll take it away maybe a little more slowly, and we'll let you keep some of it for a while. That's kind of what I'm thinking. But to be honest, I haven't worked out the plan in much detail, but I'm totally opposed to cash payments. What I'm really just thinking is permission for them to operate a little bit longer than what they deserve.
Yeah, thanks. I want to be respectful of time, but at least. Okay, so the question is, I think this is a realist question. So the question is, 7% of oil is for petrochemical products, including plastics. So that continuing with all of that would reduce the size of the oil and gas industry by 97%. It seems to me that we will need more petrochemical products such as batteries, wind turbine blades, et cetera, to support the renewable sector. Could that not be used as an incentive for cooperation from them? Also, plastics do not cause global warming, so the problem with plastics is our management of them, is it not?
Yeah, so plastics are a really interesting case. It's easy for the oil industry to say, sure, I mean, you're not burning them, right? You're not putting them in a gas tank. So in that respect, the plastic itself, I'm not an expert on this part of it, but common sense is going to tell you that a plastic bottle does not emit as much CO2 as a gallon of gas in your tank. Okay, I will definitely concede that. But I am enough informed to know that the production of plastics does emit greenhouse gas emissions at various parts of the way. And if plastics require petroleum for feedstock, well, that still requires you to produce the oil, and perhaps you have to explore for the oil. And there's greenhouse gas emissions being produced every step of the way. I think, we could probably Google it and find out that production of plastics does produce a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, maybe not as much as oil for transportation purposes. But I don't think we can only talk about greenhouse gas emissions anymore. We've done that for too long. People who care about climate change have ignored the local pollution, the pollution in the air and the pollution in the water and the environmental justice issues. And so I don't think pollution in air and water is acceptable anymore. Just because I don't live near an oil refinery doesn't mean it's okay that somebody else does, as long as the oil is made into plastic. So now the question is, do we need plastics? Somehow society managed to survive without plastics for like 8,000 years, right? Until the 20th century. Somehow that happened. Okay, I get it. Plastics have really incorporated themselves into modern life. And I see a medical doctor in the back, and I know that plastics are important in medicine. They're important in medical devices, and oil is a part of drugs and pharmaceuticals. So I know you can't just pull it all out immediately. You need some kind of a plan to transition to something else. And I'm not an expert in that field, but I do know that many applications of plastic can be replaced with other things. For applications of plastic that can't yet be replaced with other things, this is part of the negotiation. This is part of the deal. We'll let you make this medical device with this plastic part for X number of years. And you can still make some money from the oil that you've got while we look for an alternative. As far as batteries go, or components for solar panels, wind turbines, geothermal, whatever other clean energy we're going to come up with, we'll also have to find alternatives. I'm not comfortable saying that we will have to use plastic forever to produce clean energy. We have to use plastic now to produce clean energy, but there are already alternatives that are being investigated. And I'm confident that much of the use of plastic in clean energy can be eliminated, and we will just have to phase out the rest. Again, not being an expert in materials, I may be naive, but I've worked in the solar industry long enough and seen enough progress on materials that I believe it's probably possible to phase out 80% of plastic by 2050.
Thank you again, Erik, very much. And for those of you that are watching online, if you want to order the book, you can go to ericcurren.com. And that's Erik with a K, C-U-R-R-E-N. Correct?
Yes, that's
We
right.
had this discussion a couple weeks ago about the various spellings of Curren. It's as bad as Schwarzenegger. Not quite, but there are multiple spellings.
There are, yeah, it's confusing. Mine is Curren like electric current.
Oh, okay. Well, that's easy to remember. Thank you all for coming. Erik has copies of the book that he'd be happy to sign for you. And again, those of you online, if you want to access that, go to ericcurren.com, and there'll be a link there where you can purchase the book. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Erik.
Thank you, everyone.